The wind was a blade against the clapboard walls of the small house, a relentless predator seeking entry. It found every crack, every seam, whispering of the desolation that lay both outside and in. Inside, the air was thick with a silence more menacing than the gale. Elara stood by the cold hearth, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white stones. The fire, once the heart of their home, was now just a bed of sullen, gray ashes. Starved of the wood her brother-in-law, Jedediah, refused to spare. Her daughters, Hannah and Sarah, were huddled together on the thin mattress in the corner, their small forms a testament to a fear they were too young to name but old enough to feel in the marrow of their bones. It was the fear of their mother's stillness, of the hunger that gnawed quietly in their bellies, and of the shadow their uncle cast long before he ever entered the room. He had just left, his words still hanging in the air like frost. Useless, he had spat, his gaze sweeping over the two girls. Another winter, and for what? To feed mouths that will never carry the family name or work a man's portion of the land. Samuel left you with nothing but burdens. Elara felt the brand of his pronouncement on her very soul. A widow's portion was meager, but a widow with only daughters was a curse in the eyes of men like Jedediah. He saw the deed to this land, his brother's land, as his birthright, and she and her children were merely obstacles to be worn down, starved out and swept away like chaff. She closed her eyes, the scent of wood smoke and old sorrow filling her lungs. She could feel the texture of the rough-hewn floorboards beneath her worn shoes, the oppressive weight of the low ceiling. This house, built by her Samuel's own hands, had once been a sanctuary. Now it was a cage, and Jedediah was the keeper of the key. A tremor ran through her, not of cold, but of a despair so profound it threatened to swallow the last flicker of her resilience. What was she to do? The town was a day's ride, and the charity there was a cruel, public spectacle she could not bear. Here, there was only Jedediah's suffocating cruelty and the vast, indifferent wilderness. She was trapped between the malice of man and the apathy of nature. Opening her eyes, she looked at her daughters. Hannah, the elder at 7, was watching her, her gaze wide with a solemn understanding that broke Elara's heart. Sarah, just 5, had buried her face in her sister's shoulder. They were not burdens. They were her heart, her lungs, her reason for drawing one more painful breath. The thought was a small, defiant spark in the suffocating darkness of her fear. It was not enough to warm her, but it was enough to see by. Days bled into a week, each one a careful negotiation with hunger and cold. Elara rationed the last of the flour and dried beans, her movements deliberate and slow to conserve what little energy she had. The wind did not cease, and the sky remained a sheet of hammered pewter. It was during this bleak stretch that she first noticed the changes. One morning, upon opening the door to the gray, biting air, she found a rabbit on the stoop. It was freshly killed, laid out neatly, its dark eyes staring into nothing. Her first thought was of Jedediah, a cruel trick, perhaps. But his cruelty was never so subtle. He preferred the open wound of words. She scanned the horizon, the stark line of pines that bordered the property, but saw nothing, no one. With trembling hands, she took the offering inside, her mind a whirl of suspicion and a desperate, rising gratitude. The stew she made that night was thin, but it was the first real meat they had tasted in weeks. Her daughters ate with a quiet reverence, and for the first time in a long time, Elara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the meager fire. 2 days later, a section of the paddock fence that had been leaning precariously, a daily reproach from Jedediah about her inability to manage, was standing straight and true. A new rail, cut from fresh pine, had been skillfully wedged into place. No one had asked. No one had been seen. She began to watch. Her gaze, once turned inward to her own misery, now scanned the periphery of her world. She started to notice him, Caleb. He was a man who lived on the edge of things, on a small plot of land upstream that no one else had wanted. He kept to himself, a silent, brooding figure seen only at a distance. The town whispered about him, that he was strange, that he preferred the company of the wilderness to that of people. He rarely spoke, and his face, weathered and stern, gave nothing away. She saw him sometimes, moving through the trees like a ghost, axe on his shoulder. He never looked her way, never acknowledged her existence. Yet the evidence of his passage was undeniable. A small, carefully stacked pile of firewood appeared near her woodpile, separate from her own dwindling supply. It was dry, split, ready for the hearth. He was watching over them. The realization settled in her not with a crash, but with the quiet slowness of a sunrise. He was not one of Jedediah's men. He was an antidote to them. His were actions, not words. His help was silent, offered without expectation of thanks, without the price of submission. A strange and fragile trust began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. One afternoon, as a cruel sleet began to fall, she saw him walking the creek bed below her property. Their eyes met across the distance. It was for only a second. He did not smile, nor did she. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and continued on his way. It was enough. It was a conversation, a treaty, an alliance forged in the quiet spaces where words failed. She began to leave a small token in return. A water skin filled with fresh well water left on a fence post she knew he would pass. It was always gone the next day. This silent barter became the rhythm of their survival, a lifeline woven from unspoken understanding. The fear in her house lessened its grip, replaced by a tentative, watchful hope. The day the sky finally broke, it was not with rain, but with the thunder of Jedediah's fury. He arrived not alone, but with two grim-faced men from the town, men whose loyalty was bought with coin and drink. He didn't bother to knock, shoving the door open so hard it slammed against the wall, rattling the few plates on the shelf. Hannah and Sarah cried out, scrambling behind their mother. Alara stood her ground, placing herself between her daughters and the intruders. "This is over, Alara," Jedediah snarled, his face florid with rage and triumph. "I've been patient. I've been generous. But my generosity has its limits. This farm needs a man's hand, and you have wasted it." His eyes, small and mean, darted around the sparse cabin, judging its poverty as her personal failing. "I have papers," he said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Legal. The magistrate agrees. The property reverts to the closest male kin for proper management." He took a step forward, his bulk filling the small room, smelling of sweat and sour whiskey. "You and your girls will be taken to the church mission in Cutter's Creek, a poor farm, a place of last resort of public shame and slow decay." It was a sentence of social death. "No," Alara said, her voice low but clear, a thread of steel in the suffocating tension. "This was Samuel's home. This is our home." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It was his home. Now it's mine. Get your things." "You have 1 hour," he reached out, his hand closing around her arm in a brutal grip. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A sharp, searing pain shot up her arm, but it was the violation, the raw assertion of his power, that made her flinch. The girls were weeping now, their small sobs tearing at what was left of her composure. It was in that moment, as despair threatened to finally claim her, that the doorway darkened. Caleb stood there. He was not a large man, not like Jedediah, but he filled the space with a presence that was absolute. He carried no weapon, only the stillness of the ancient forest and the cold, hard light of reckoning in his eyes. He had a brace of squirrels in one hand, which he dropped silently to the floor. His gaze moved from Jedediah's hand on Alara's arm, to her pale, defiant face, and then to the terrified children behind her. Jedediah, startled, released her. "This is family business, Caleb. Not for you to meddle in." Caleb's eyes, the color of a winter sky, settled on Jedediah. He said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became a weapon itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of stone. "Let them be." Jedediah puffed out his chest. "I have the law on my side. She has nothing."
No sons.
No claim, he gestured dismissively at Alara. She is a burden the law has seen fit to remove. Caleb took a single step into the room. It was not a threatening move, but it shifted the balance of power entirely. He looked past Jedediah, directly at Alara, a question in his eyes she had no trouble understanding. She gave the smallest of nods, a transfer of trust made absolute. His gaze returned to Jedediah, flat and final. "No more," he declared, the words cutting through the tension like an axe through deadwood. "She comes with me." Jedediah stood frozen, his blustering rage deflating into disbelief, then sputtering indignation. The two men he had brought with him shifted uneasily, looking from Jedediah's mottled face to Caleb's unyielding calm. They were hired for bullying a helpless widow, not for confronting a man who looked as if he were carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. Caleb's declaration was not a plea or a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, as immutable as the turning of the earth. He was not asking for permission. He was ending a siege. "You can't," Jedediah stammered, his authority crumbling. You have no right." Caleb simply looked at him, his silence a more profound answer than any argument. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Alara again. "Get your girls," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. Without hesitation, Alara moved. The spell of her paralysis was broken. She gathered her daughters, murmuring soothing words, her hands swift and sure as she wrapped them in their thin shawls. She took nothing else. Not the threadbare blankets, not the iron pot, not a single memento of the life that was now over. Those things belonged to the house of her sorrow. Her only true possessions were the two small, warm hands that slipped into hers. She led them towards the door, past Jedediah, who stood gaping like a landed fish. His hired men shuffled back, clearing a path, their eyes avoiding hers. As she stepped over the threshold and into the cold, clean air, Caleb fell into step beside her. He did not take her arm or offer a comforting word. He simply walked with them, a silent, solid presence at her side. They did not look back. The walk to his homestead was not long, but it was a journey across a lifetime. They followed the creek, the sound of the water a gentle counterpoint to the fading echoes of Jedediah's rage. The sleet had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to thin, allowing pale, watery sunlight to touch the land. Alara looked at the man beside her. She knew so little of him, and yet, in the way that mattered most, she knew everything. He was a man of quiet decency, of action over empty proclamation. He had seen her not as a burden, but as a person deserving of protection. He had seen her daughters not as liabilities, but as children in need of a shield. When they reached his cabin, it was smaller than hers, but it was sturdy, and a curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a promise of warmth within. He opened the door and stood aside, allowing her and the girls to enter first. Inside it was spare but clean. A fire burned brightly in the hearth. A haunch of venison hung from the rafters. It smelled of pine and wood smoke and safety. Alara stood in the center of the room, her daughters clinging to her skirts, and felt a slow, deep breath fill her lungs for what felt like the first time in a year. The weight she had carried, the constant, crushing fear, began to dissolve. She had not been rescued in the way the stories told it. She had been met. Her own quiet endurance had been recognized and joined by another's strength. She was not his property, not his prize. She was his partner in this harsh, demanding land. Looking at her daughters, who were now staring with wide, curious eyes at the dancing flames, she knew this was not an ending. It was a beginning, forged in hardship, tempered by kindness, and built on the solid ground of mutual respect. The future was an unknown territory, as wild and untamed as the landscape outside, but for the first time, she did not have to face it alone.